Hello everybody. Today I would like to continue a thread that I started in my previous video. There, I discussed the Dutch colonization of the East Indies, and their methods and motivations, and I also connected this to the Marxist concept of primitive accumulation, the process that occurred at the beginning of the capitalist production system. What I looked at then was the role that the Dutch colonization of the Spice Islands played in laying the foundations of capitalism. This is a thread that I would like to pursue again in this video, and hopefully in future videos as well. But today, I would like to go to the other side of the world from the East Indies and look at the West Indies instead, and the activities of the Dutch in this region. Specifically, what I want to explore is how a few small islands in the Caribbean were integrated into the developing global economy, and how they contributed to the birth of capitalism. Today, the Dutch actually still retain control over their Caribbean possessions, which never sought independence during the decolonization movements of the latter half of the 20th century. Instead, they gained significant autonomy, and their status has been elevated to be equal with that of the European Netherlands. The Dutch Caribbean consists of 6 islands: Sint Maarten, Saba, Sint Eustatius, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao. In total, they comprise an area of only 360 square miles and hold about 340,000 people. All of these islands have been held by the Dutch for over 300 years. And today, I would like to briefly explain how the Dutch acquired these islands, their colonial era history, and what happened in this relatively overlooked area of the world. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the islands of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, collectively and informally called the ABC Islands, were relatively peaceful and stable. They were inhabited by the Quaquetios people, a subgroup of the Arawak tribes that originally inhabited the coast of Venezuela. Despite being on islands, the Quaquetios were not isolated. In fact, they maintained close contact with the other Arawak tribes, and regularly sailed to and traded with the people of the mainland. The Quaquetios relied primarily on the sea, fishing, harvesting shellfish, and hunting birds and sea turtles. From trade with the mainland, they were able to get vegetables and fruit as well. The Quaquetios left behind lots of pottery and rock paintings, many of which can still be seen today. And significantly, as we'll see later, the natives also knew how to produce salt from seawater and maintain some salt plains, though on a limited scale. At this time, the only threat to the natives of the ABC Islands was the hostile Carib tribes that were moving across the Caribbean and South America and attacking the Arawak. Fortunately, Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire were outside the range of the Carib and remained safe from attack. The inhabitants of the ABC Islands would therefore live in relative safety for over 1,000 years. All of this would change, however, in 1499, when Spanish explorers arrived under the leadership of Alonso de Ojeda. The Spanish would describe the islands as being inhabited by giants and a potential source of Brazil wood. But more importantly, they would call the islands Isla Inútiles, or useless islands, because they had no gold or other minerals the Spanish were interested in, and the islands were too arid for agriculture. So instead, the Spanish decided to simply enslave the native population. Around 2,000 people from Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao were captured and forced to work in the mines on Hispaniola. Alonso de Ojeda was initially appointed as a commander of the islands, but was soon called back to Spain, where he was put on trial for cruelty, errors in judgment, and failing to fulfill his missions in the New World. He was then exiled to a convent in Hispaniola, where he died in poverty in 1515. In 1526, Juan de Ampuez and his son-in-law, Lazoar Bejarano, took over Curaçao in an attempt to grow crops on it. This venture failed, and Ampuez would die with enormous debts in 1533. However, they did have one major impact on the islands when they convinced the Spanish authorities to let the enslaved natives return to Curaçao, though they would still remain in slavery and were forced to work on plantations. At this point, a strange quirk of history would occur. In the early 1500s, the King of Spain, Charles I, had acquired a large debt to the Westlers, a German banking family, To pay off his debt, he gave them control of Venezuela in 1528, one of the few times a German nation would possess colonies in the New World, and meaning that Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire were now under German administration. This arrangement would last until 1546, when the Spanish seized control of Venezuela and executed the German colonial rulers. With these changes in administration and the failures of the plantations, the ABC Islands would largely be forgotten by their absentee Spanish rulers, falling into obscurity where they would remain for the next 100 years. By the 1630s, the geopolitical situation in the Caribbean had changed dramatically. Other European powers had arrived in the region, like Great Britain and France, and they had conquered several islands in the Antilles. Additionally, Europe was embroiled in numerous decades-long wars. One of these was the 30 Years' War, a long and bloody war over religion and succession that devastated Europe in the first half of the 1600s. One part of this war involved the Dutch attempting to secure independence from the Spanish. This war would last from 1621 to 1648. When war broke out, the Dutch were put into a difficult position economically. Fishing made up a significant part of their economy, meaning they relied heavily on salt, which was used to preserve fish. Normally, the Dutch acquired their salt from Spanish and Portuguese markets, but the war with Spain meant that the Dutch were now cut off from their normal sources of salt. Therefore, the Dutch were forced to find salt elsewhere, outside of Europe. So, they began to look to North and South America for salt and to establish bases for privateers that could attack the Spanish colonies and hurt their maritime trade routes. Their first step was capturing the island of St. Martin in 1630, but this occupation didn't last long, and the Spanish retook the island in 1633. So, the Dutch now assembled a strong military force and launched an attack on Curaçao. In 1634, Admiral Johannes von Walbeck launched a naval invasion that successfully conquered Curaçao and neighboring Bonaire and Aruba. They fortified these islands and managed to fend off Spanish counterattacks. Under firm Dutch control, the ABC Islands would become a valuable source of salt and a military base for privateers in the Dutch Navy to plunder Spanish trade and attack Spanish colonies. In 1636, the Dutch also established a colony on St. Eustatius, and colonists from there would in turn colonize the nearby island of Saba. To administer their territories in the New World, the Dutch West India Company was founded in 1621. The WIC was a charter company of Dutch merchants, and given permission by the Dutch government to raise armies and fleets to conquer colonies and promote Dutch trade. The company was set up as a rival to the powerful Dutch East India Company, and given a monopoly of Dutch trade in West Africa, North America, and, most importantly, the Dutch portion of the Atlantic slave trade. The WIC was also put in charge of coordinating military operations in North America against the Spanish. In 1638, they assigned Peter Stuyvesant as commander of the Dutch forces in the West Indies. And in 1644, he launched an attack on St. Martin to drive out the Spanish, but failed, and was beaten back by the island's defenders. In the battle, he actually lost his leg after being hit with a cannonball, and afterwards Stuyvesant was then reassigned to the New Netherlands, the Dutch colonies on Manhattan Island. Despite fending off the Dutch invasion, the Spanish decided to withdraw from St. Martin, since they had suffered too many casualties in the battle over an island that, for them, held little strategic value. After the Spanish left, the Dutch and the French both moved in to take the island for themselves. The end result was that they divided St. Martin between them, and to this day, the island remains divided in two, with the French controlling the northern half and the Dutch controlling the southern half. In 1648, the Dutch and Spanish finally signed a peace treaty, the Peace of Munster, that granted independence to the Netherlands. The treaty also recognized Dutch control over its Caribbean colonies of Curaçao, Aruba, Bonaire, St. Eustatius, Saba, and St. Martin. All 6 islands would remain under Dutch control to the present day. The Dutch colonies in the Caribbean would become centers of trade and commerce in the 16 and 1700s. The influx of settlers and merchants would help develop and diversify the island's exports. Aloe vera was grown, coral was turned into chalk, and salt was produced from seawater. But the most important commodity was slaves. Curaçao became a center of the slave trade, where slaves captured in Africa were held until they were sent to Dutch or Spanish colonies on the North and South American mainlands. Between 1674 and 1740, over 60,000 slaves were imported into Curaçao, and over 10,000 slaves would be imported into St. Eustatius. The WIC was given the task of supplying the Spanish colonies with slaves, and so Dutch merchants and slavers grew very wealthy. The enslaved population also often outnumbered the European population. For example, in 1720, around 56% of Curaçao's population was slaves, compared to 43% European. In 1790, St. Eustatius was 63% slave, and St. Martin was over 75% enslaved. Due to the absence of large plantations, only 25% of Curaçao slaves that remained on the island would actually end up working in fields. The rest were employed in a wide variety of occupations like sailors, carpenters, fishermen, shoemakers, cooks, domestic servants, musicians, and bricklayers. To support the influx of slaves, the islands of Aruba and Bonaire were used to raise food. On Aruba, the surviving Coquetio people were forced to raise cattle. On Bonaire, the island's Brazil wood forests were all cut down and sold to Europe. In their place, cattle, sheep, and horses were raised. I think it's important here to note and emphasize that the economies and societies of these three islands were all transformed for the sole purpose of supporting the slave trade. Curaçao was turned into a site to hold slaves, while the neighboring islands were converted to sites for food production to support the slave population. Essentially, the island chain was turned into a factory for the production of slaves, all to generate profits for the West India Company and the Dutch nation. Curaçao would also become a hub for piracy. In 1675, the Dutch opened the island up to free trade, resulting in an influx of smuggling, illicit trade, and contraband from other European powers, which made Curaçao wealthy. Throughout the 16 and 1700s, there would be multiple wars between major European powers. France, Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands would often be at war with each other. Privateering became a major weapon of economic warfare that was used to attack the enemy's trade. Dutch pirates would attack the Spanish, British pirates would attack the Dutch, and so on. Sometimes allies would even pirate off each other, like Dutch pirates would steal Spanish goods, trade them to the WIC authorities, who would in turn sell them back to the Spanish. The islands weren't safe from pirates either. For example, some English privateers would attack Saba and St. Eustatius, destroying settlements and even enslaving some of the Dutch settlers. And of course, salt would also be an important commodity. Salt production on Curaçao would fail, but on Bonaire and St. Martin it would flourish, and these islands would become major sites of salt production for the Dutch economy. Salt production would even continue into the late 1800s, until the abolition of slavery made the operations unprofitable. Culturally, the ABC Islands are rather interesting. Despite being under the control of the Netherlands, Dutch would not become the main language on the islands. A Creole language called Papiamentu developed at this time, most likely from a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, and various African languages spoken by slaves, though the actual origins of the language remain disputed. Spanish would also remain commonly spoken on the islands due to their close proximity to Spanish colonies in Venezuela. Catholic missionaries would often visit the islands, and so Catholicism would remain the dominant religion. All of this would actually become rather contentious in the 1800s, as Dutch colonial authorities attempted to suppress the indigenous languages and promote Dutch in schools instead, though with little success. A large free black and Creole population grew on the island, as many slaves eventually acquired freedom. White, black, and indigenous populations mixed, though not necessarily voluntary due to the slave economy. Additionally, one of the oldest Jewish communities, was founded on Curaçao in the 1670s. Jews had originally arrived in the Netherlands to escape persecution in Spain, and then moved on to the Dutch Caribbean to become merchants or slave traders. Curaçao would be the main Dutch trade and slave hub in the 1600s, but as the 1700s progressed, the island of St. Eustatius would take its place as a commercial hub. By the 1720s, it overshadowed Curaçao in the slave trade and experienced prosperity as an important trading port for the 13 colonies during the American Revolution, until the British sacked the island in 1781. I should also note here that the Dutch also attempted to colonize other islands. Dutch settlers founded New Walcheren in Great Courland Bay on Tobago, which lasted until 1636, when it was destroyed by the Spanish. The Dutch returned to Tobago in the 1660s, but were later expelled by the French in the 1670s. The Dutch also made several attempts to colonize the Virgin Islands: a fort on St. Croix in 1625, a WIC post on St. Thomas in 1657, WIC posts on Tortola, Anegada, and Virgin Gorda, all of which were either conquered by or sold off to other European powers by the 1680s. The 1700s would also see growing unrest among the slave population. In 1740, unrest caused the governor of Curaçao to impose a 9 o'clock curfew and limit the gathering of slaves to no more than 6 people. Then in 1750, a slave revolt broke out at the plantation of Hato on the north coast of Curaçao. Slaves rose up and armed themselves with rifles, axes, and knives. They attacked neighboring houses, burned buildings, and killed some loyal slaves. They then planned to march on the capital of Willemstad, but the governor organized a militia of whites and free blacks to launch a counterattack, and so the slave revolt was quickly crushed. Some rebelling slaves chose to jump from the cliffs into the sea rather than be forced back into slavery. The Haitian Revolution would inspire a similar mass slave revolt on Curaçao in 1795 under a slave named Tula, though it was far less successful than its Haitian counterpart, devolving to guerrilla warfare before being completely crushed within a few months. By the end of the 18th century, the Dutch slave trade was dying out, as they were unable to compete with the British. In 1791, facing financial difficulty, the Dutch West India Company was disbanded, and the Dutch Caribbean islands came under control of the Council of American Colonies and Possessions, administered directly by the Dutch government. In the early 1800s, the Napoleonic Wars broke out, and the Netherlands was occupied by France. The British, who were at war with France, occupied the Dutch colonies around the world. From around 1806 to 1814, the Dutch Caribbean would be occupied by Britain, finally being returned to the Netherlands under the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814. Since the WIC was no longer in existence, the islands became Dutch colonies and were administered as one unit, the territory of Curaçao and dependencies. They would slowly gain autonomy in the 20th century, but would remain Dutch possessions. Unlike the Spice Islands I had talked about in the previous video, which faded into obscurity as their wealth disappeared, the Dutch West Indies would remain somewhat affluent, eventually shifting to an economy based on oil and tourism in the 20th and 21st centuries. However, we can see the present society in these islands was built on the slave trade and violent methods of colonization. Of course, European violence, conquest, slave trade, and destruction of indigenous communities probably isn't surprising to my listeners, but what I would like to emphasize is that this violence wasn't done in a vacuum. All across the world, starting the 1500s and continuing to even today, a vast process of expropriation and plundering was carried out to fund the wealth of Europe. The slave trade between Africa and the Caribbean, the indigenous peoples forced to work the spice plantations in Indonesia, the brutal encomienda system built by the Spanish across the Americas, were all done with the purpose of extracting resources and building the wealth of Europe. And as we can see in this brief overview, even small islands were not safe from the European colonial powers which sought to integrate everything they could find into the emerging global economy and capitalist system of production.